I made It Ends With Us and all these films for a very specific reason, but I also wanted people to think I was a good director or a good actor, and I wanted my place in the industry. And I think I've really learned over the course of the last 2 years that it really doesn't.
2 years of silence just broke, and the words that came out changed the entire shape of this story. On July 8th, 2026, Justin Baldoni finally sat in front of a camera next to his wife and said the thing millions of people had been waiting to hear him address directly. He didn't name names. He didn't mention the movie, but everyone watching knew exactly what he was talking about and what he chose to say and chose not to say. Confirmed suspicions that had been building since the summer of 2024. This is the full story of how a film about surviving abuse turned into one of the most explosive legal wars in modern Hollywood history, and how it all ended with a settlement, a courtroom battle over legal fees that is still raging as we speak, and a 5-minute video that reopened every wound the public thought had finally closed. In August 2024, It Ends With Us hit theaters, carrying enormous cultural weight. Based on Colleen Hoover's best-selling novel, the story follows a woman confronting an abusive relationship, a theme that resonated with millions of readers who had spent years anticipating a film adaptation. Justin Baldoni directed the picture and starred opposite Blake Lively, who also served as a producer. By financial measures alone, the film was an undeniable success, pulling in more than $350 million worldwide and landing among the year's biggest box office performers. On paper, everyone involved should have been celebrating one of the year's genuine breakout hits. But even as the film was breaking out commercially, something was visibly wrong behind the scenes. During the press tour that same month, entertainment reporters and fans noticed an unmistakable coldness between the two leads. Lively appeared at premieres and junkets laughing with other cast members, while Baldoni conducted separate interviews and seemed distanced from the promotional machine surrounding his own film. Photos from red carpet events showed Lively surrounded by Reynolds, her co-star Brandon Sklenar, and other members of the cast, while Baldoni's appearances were noticeably solo. Online sleuths began building theories about a rift almost immediately, months before anyone outside the production knew just how serious the underlying conflict actually was. Some fans also criticized Lively's tone during interviews, feeling it clashed with the heavy subject matter of the film itself, which added another layer of public scrutiny to an already strange promotional cycle. Entertainment outlets ran headlines asking whether the two stars were feuding, and cast members were repeatedly asked to comment on the obvious tension, with most offering carefully diplomatic non-answers that only fueled more speculation. What the public didn't know yet was that Lively had reportedly raised concerns about Baldoni's conduct during filming itself, more than a year before any of this became public. According to her later legal complaint, she alleged that Baldoni made inappropriate comments about her body and weight, kissed her without consent during certain scenes, showed her his phone with pornographic images, and pushed to include improvised intimate material she said she never agreed to when she originally signed on to the project. Her complaint also alleged that Baldoni and members of his team entered her trailer unannounced on more than one occasion, including at a time when she said she was not fully dressed. At one point before filming resumed, Lively and her husband Ryan Reynolds are said to have hosted a meeting where she arrived with a written list of specific requests intended to make the set safer, including an explicit understanding that no further intimate content would be added beyond what she had originally signed off on, and that an intimacy coordinator would be present for any physical scenes going forward. Baldoni and his production company, Wayfarer Studios, reportedly agreed to those terms in that meeting. Whether that agreement was fully honored for the remainder of the shoot became one of the central and most disputed questions of the legal fight that followed, and it is a question that, even after everything that has happened since, has never been answered inside a courtroom. The tension might have stayed a quiet Hollywood rumor if not for what happened at the very end of 2024. On December 20th, Lively filed a formal complaint with the California Civil Rights Department, laying out detailed allegations that Baldoni and people around him had created a hostile environment during production and then worked to retaliate against her once she raised concerns. The very next day, the New York Times published an investigation that turned the entire situation into a national story. The article examined a trove of internal communications involving Baldoni's crisis public relations team including Jennifer Abel and Melissa Nathan, communications that reporters said they had reviewed across thousands of pages of texts and emails. Those messages, according to the Times, revealed a coordinated strategy aimed at shifting public attention away from Baldoni's conduct and toward undermining Lively's credibility instead, including efforts to plant favorable stories and generate the appearance of organic online support. One line from those exchanges became infamous almost overnight. Nathan reportedly told a colleague they could not put certain things in writing because, as she put it, site index equals 11-1. They could bury anyone. /site, that single phrase became shorthand for the entire scandal and gave the Times investigation its title. The fallout was immediate and severe. Baldoni was dropped by his talent agency within days of the story running. SAG-AFTRA issued a statement calling the allegations troubling. Former collaborators of Lively spoke up in support of her, and the conversation around the film shifted almost entirely away from its themes of domestic abuse and toward what was happening behind the cameras. What had been designed as a quiet reputation management operation became, by the start of 2025, the single most damaging thing connected to Baldoni's name, effectively swallowing the film's own marketing narrative whole. The scandal didn't stay contained to Lively and Baldoni for long, either. In late December 2024, Baldoni's former publicist, Stephanie Jones, who had represented him and Wayfarer Studios before Abel left to join Nathan's crisis operation, filed her own lawsuit against Abel, Nathan, Baldoni, and Wayfarer. Jones alleged that Abel and Nathan had run a secret campaign not only against Lively, but against Jones herself, working to poach her clients, steal confidential business documents, and damage her business on their way out the door, all while she remained completely unaware of what her own employee was orchestrating behind her back. Jones's legal team pointed to digital forensic evidence, tying an anonymous attack website targeting her to what they described as a broader network of similar sites aimed at other individuals, suggesting the operation was larger and more organized than a single film dispute. Reporting on the case later noted that the fallout eventually pulled in other public figures entirely unconnected to the film, including podcaster Andrew Huberman and actress Rebel Wilson, both of whom became entangled in the widening web of allegations about the same network of operatives. Baldoni's camp fired back at Jones, with his attorney arguing that she had maliciously handed over private communications and accusing her of orchestrating her own revenge campaign after being pushed out of the Wayfarer account. Jones's team countered that the material had been obtained through a legitimate subpoena rather than any unauthorized leak, and that the real story was a pattern of contractual breaches and coordinated reputational sabotage carried out by Abel and Nathan. That secondary legal war between Jones, Abel, Nathan, and Wayfarer would continue running in parallel to the main event for well over a year, adding dozens of additional filings and depositions to an already sprawling legal record that eventually involved multiple law firms, several publicists, and at least 3 A-list celebrities. Once the Times story broke, the legal filings came fast and rarely let up for the following year and a half. Lively's federal lawsuit followed her California Civil Rights Department complaint, naming Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, Wayfarer Chief Executive Jamie Heath, and members of the Crisis Communications team as defendants. Her complaint alleged violations of federal and California law across 13 separate causes of action, running more than 80 pages, and including claims of retaliation tied to her raising workplace safety concerns during and after production. Baldoni's legal team, led by attorney Brian Friedman, pushed back hard and did so publicly, taking the fight to television studios rather than letting it play out quietly in court filings alone. Friedman argued in numerous appearances that Lively had never been harassed and instead accused her and Reynolds of orchestrating the entire narrative themselves as part of a power struggle over creative control of the film's release and marketing. At the close of 2024, on New Year's Eve, Baldoni filed a defamation lawsuit against the New York Times, seeking $250 million. Arguing the paper had built its story around selectively chosen and misleadingly framed communications. Just weeks later, in January 2025, he escalated further, filing a $400 million countersuit against Lively, Reynolds, and Lively's publicist Leslie Sloan, accusing them of defamation, civil extortion, and attempting to seize control of the film's legacy for themselves. For a while, it looked like the war would only intensify, with each side filing motions and counter-motions at a pace that made the case difficult for even seasoned entertainment reporters to track in real time. But the courts began chipping away at Baldoni's side of the fight fairly early on. In June 2025, federal judge Louis Lyman dismissed Baldoni's defamation suit against Lively and her team, finding that both Lively and the newspaper were shielded by legal protections covering litigation-related communication and reporting on ongoing litigation. Ryan Reynolds successfully petitioned to have his name dropped from the $400 million countersuit a few months later, and the remaining case against Lively and Sloan met a similar fate not long after that. By October 2025, Lyman had entered a final judgment effectively closing that entire chapter of Baldoni's legal offensive for good, with both parties retaining the right to appeal. Throughout the process, sealed communications continued spilling into public view in waves, each one generating fresh headlines. Financial records suggested Wayfarer had paid a social media consultant named Jed Wallace tens of thousands of dollars a month to help generate favorable online sentiment and counter negative narratives during the summer of 2024, an arrangement that itself spawned a separate lawsuit when Wallace sued Lively over her public characterization of his role. Court filings unsealed in January 2026 also revealed internal commentary from Sony Pictures executives who had been sharply critical of how Lively handled the press rollout, with some of the language used described by multiple outlets as startlingly harsh, adding yet another layer of tension to an already crowded legal battlefield and complicating the simple narrative either side had hoped to present. Briefly, even Taylor Swift's name entered the case when text exchanges between her and Lively were unsealed during discovery, though her attorney successfully avoided having her sit for a formal deposition, and the pop star remained a bystander to the broader legal war rather than a participant in it. By April 2026, Judge Lyman issued a sweeping 152-page order that reshaped the entire case. He dismissed 10 of Lively's original 16 causes of action, including her sexual harassment, defamation, and false light invasion of privacy claims, ruling that several of them fell outside the reach of the specific statutes she had invoked because of her legal classification on the production. But 3 claims survived and were set for a jury trial scheduled for May 18, 2026. Breach of contract, retaliation, and aiding and abetting retaliation. Both sides had reason to feel like they had something to prove and something to lose when that date arrived, and both had already spent well over a year and untold millions of dollars in legal fees getting to that point. It never made it to a jury. On May 4, 2026, just 2 weeks before opening arguments were set to begin, attorneys for both Lively and Baldoni's side announced they had reached a settlement. A joint statement, signed by lawyers on both sides, acknowledged that the production process had presented real challenges and stated plainly that the concerns Lively had raised deserved to be heard. Both camps expressed hope that the resolution would allow everyone involved to move forward and rebuild a more respectful environment going forward, both in the industry and online. According to reporting from TMZ shortly after the announcement, no money changed hands as part of the core settlement itself, and Lively had reportedly brought in a new litigation-focused law firm known for high-profile courtroom victories in the final days before the deal was struck, only to pivot toward resolution rather than trial once the reality of the narrowed case set in. The settlement statement notably did not include any direct apology from Baldoni, a detail that outlets covering the announcement flagged almost immediately as significant. What the settlement explicitly did not resolve was the question of legal fees. Lively's team had a pending motion seeking to have Wayfarer cover her attorney's costs under a specific section of California Civil Code, Section 47.1, a law specifically designed to protect people who report sexual misconduct from retaliatory defamation lawsuits, and both sides agreed that motion would remain alive and pending before the court even after the rest of the case wrapped up. That fight over fees has continued escalating in the months since, and it is, as of this recording, still not fully resolved. Judge Lyman ultimately ruled that Lively could pursue attorneys' fees under that protective statute, a ruling with real significance, because it meant a federal judge had looked at the sequence of events and concluded that Baldoni's side had engaged in exactly the kind of retaliatory legal conduct the statute was written to discourage. Lyman did deny her request for punitive damages, however, saying that particular remedy fell outside the procedural rules governing this part of the case. In mid-June 2026, the full settlement agreement became public, showing that both sides agreed to end all remaining disputes and irrevocably waive their rights to appeal either the settlement itself or the underlying rulings that led to it. And in a striking twist, Baldoni's own attorney chose to release the complete settlement document to the public himself in mid-July, telling media outlets he wanted to give everyone involved a sense of finality after nearly 2 years of relentless headlines, and describing his client as feeling genuinely at peace with how things had ended. As of this past week, Baldoni's legal team is formally contesting the request for legal fees and expenses that Lively's lawyers have filed, a request that totals close to $8 million once litigation expenses are included. Baldoni's attorneys called the figure stunning and excessive in their filing, arguing that Lively's team logged more than 7,000 hours of billable work, a number they described as roughly 20 times what courts have typically found reasonable in comparable defamation cases. They are asking the court to either deny the request outright or reduce it substantially, pointing to a much smaller fee award the New York Times received after successfully defending against Baldoni's own defamation suit as a point of comparison. That particular fight is still unresolved, and it may end up being the very last major piece of this saga, still working its way through the courts. Lively's attorneys, for their part, framed the overall outcome as a clear vindication. Her legal team described the resolution as confirming that the concerns she raised from the very beginning were real, that the settlement and the fee ruling together ended what they characterized as the fiction that her claims had been fabricated, and that the case exposed a deliberate effort to intimidate and silence her using the legal system itself. Baldoni's side, meanwhile, pointed to the fact that the vast majority of Lively's original claims, including every single allegation of sexual harassment, had been dismissed by the court before the case ever reached settlement, and argued that walking away without paying any direct settlement money spoke for itself. Both interpretations are technically supported by different parts of the exact same public record, which is precisely why the case has remained so contentious even after the paperwork was signed and the courtroom doors closed. For weeks after the settlement, Baldoni said nothing publicly. Then, on July 8, 2026, he and his wife Emily posted a video to their Instagram accounts, addressing his millions of followers together for the first time in nearly 2 years. Neither of them mentioned Lively by name. Neither mentioned the film, but nobody watching needed the names spoken aloud to understand exactly what the video was about. Baldoni opened by explaining that the couple had stayed quiet not because they had nothing to say, but because the timing never felt right. He described the process of praying and reflecting before finally deciding this was the moment to speak. Emily Baldoni echoed that sentiment, saying the moment finally felt different. What followed was carefully worded but unmistakably pointed. Baldoni described the family as being in a state of healing, acknowledging that the process had not been linear and had forced him to reconsider what mattered most in his life. He credited faith as central to getting through the ordeal and thanked supporters who had stood by the family without hearing a word from him directly for 2 years. Emily Baldoni's comments carried the sharpest edge of the entire video. She said that while the family felt genuine gratitude for the support they had received, that gratitude did not erase the injustice and pain they had experienced. She described grappling with difficult questions about how something like this could have happened at all, and posed a rhetorical question that instantly became the most quoted line from the entire video. How something so damaging could have been site index equals for -1, disguised as a fight for women, /site. That line landed very differently, depending on which side of the case a viewer had already aligned with. Supporters of Lively pointed out that a federal judge had allowed 3 of her claims, including retaliation, to proceed all the way to the edge of trial, and that the same judge later ruled Wayfarer could be responsible for covering her legal fees under a statute specifically designed to protect people who report workplace misconduct from retaliatory lawsuits. Supporters of Baldoni countered that every single sexual harassment allegation against him had ultimately been thrown out by the court, and argued that the settlement's acknowledgement that concerns deserved to be heard was a far cry from an admission of wrongdoing. Baldoni also addressed why he had chosen silence over the previous 2 years, explaining that he didn't want to add to what he called the noise surrounding the case, and instead wanted to let the legal process run its course. He suggested that the eventual outcome of the case spoke for itself, and Emily added that both the truth and the facts had, in her words, already done the talking. Baldoni acknowledged that there had been so many painful and, as Emily put it, untrue things said about them over the previous 2 years, and said that pileup of noise was part of why speaking sooner never felt right. He was careful throughout to say the couple was not going to say everything on their minds in that particular video, framing it instead as a first step, rather than a complete accounting of how they felt about everything that had happened. Since the controversy began, Baldoni has not announced any new acting or directing projects, a notable absence for someone who had built a substantial career as both a performer and filmmaker in the years before the lawsuit. He and his family relocated from Los Angeles to Nashville during the height of the legal proceedings, stepping back from the public spotlight almost entirely while the case unfolded in the background, largely avoiding red carpets, interviews, and the kind of public appearances that had once been a routine part of his career. Industry observers have speculated about whether he intends to return to acting or directing at all, though neither he nor his representatives have said anything definitive on that front, and the July 8 video itself made no mention of any upcoming professional plans. What the July 8 video ultimately confirmed is something many observers had already suspected for months. Baldoni sees himself as a man who was genuinely wronged by the way this entire saga played out, regardless of what the underlying facts about his on-set conduct actually were. Whether that self-portrait holds up depends heavily on which parts of an extraordinarily messy public record a person chooses to weigh most heavily. The settlement means a jury will never issue a formal verdict on the claims that survived to the edge of trial. The core financial terms of the agreement, beyond the ongoing dispute over legal fees, remain private even after the broader settlement document was released. What is left behind is an enormous public paper trail, unsealed text messages, dismissed lawsuits, a judge's detailed rulings, a still unresolved fight over millions of dollars in legal costs, and 2 fundamentally different accounts of what actually happened during and after the making of a film about a woman finding the courage to leave an abusive relationship. There is a bitter irony sitting at the center of all of this that has not been lost on anyone who followed the story closely. A movie built entirely around the theme of a woman speaking up despite enormous personal cost became the real-world backdrop for a dispute about exactly how expensive and painful that kind of courage can turn out to be, no matter which side of the courtroom a person was standing on. The film's own marketing had promised audiences a story about resilience and survival, and instead its production became a case study in how quickly a workplace dispute can metastasize into a multi-year legal war involving dozens of lawyers, several publicists, at least 4 separate lawsuits, and millions upon millions of dollars in fees, with no single side walking away looking entirely clean. It is also worth remembering just how many people beyond the 2 lead actors ended up swept into this story. Stephanie Jones is still fighting her own separate legal battle against Abel, Nathan, and Wayfarer over what she alleges was a coordinated effort to destroy her business. Jed Wallace's role as a paid social media strategist remains a point of controversy. Sony Pictures executives had their private commentary about the production dragged into open court filings, and reporters at outlets from the New York Times to Deadline to TMZ spent nearly 2 years treating this as one of the biggest ongoing stories in entertainment, publishing new developments almost weekly at the height of the litigation. Baldoni closed his July 8 video by saying there was still so much more he and Emily wanted to say, just not yet, and not in that particular moment. Whether that means more statements down the line, more legal filings over those still contested attorneys' fees, or simply the slow and private process of 2 people trying to move on after 2 years of public warfare, one thing is clear. Hollywood has not finished telling this story. The courts have not entirely finished with it either, given the unresolved fee dispute, and neither, it seems, based on his own words, has Justin Baldoni. Thanks for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand the full timeline of one of the messiest legal battles in recent Hollywood history, drop a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories dominating entertainment news.